Thank you. John?
Great, John, and thanks. It's great to be with you. Thank you, John, and thanks to President Wright for the terrific introduction. I want to take a moment and thank Chair Castor for the incredible work she did, bringing the various threads of ideas that were percolating in Congress together and really producing a report that met the moment and I think altered a lot of people's thinking. I'm going to start with making one political comment, and won't be super partisan, but I'm going to make one political comment, which is the good news of this election is that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris ran on climate, and they pledged to govern on climate, and they won on climate. And I think I can't understate how important it is that the pledges that candidates make are the things that they try to govern on. So the fact that that President-elect Biden put out bold ideas and then pushed them through into the Democratic Party platform, ran on them through the election, and indeed on Saturday night when the race had finally been called, he talked about climate in his speech that settled the matter and claimed the mantle of victory. That's truly critical in terms of how you build an administration and how you build a governing strategy. I think I want to talk a little bit about Biden's theory of the case. I'm going to echo a lot of what Chair Castor said, but Biden centered the climate crisis in the intersection of four clear crises. Obviously, the pandemic and the failure to listen to science and act on science, the economic crisis that resulted from the way that the pandemic crisis was handled, the racial justice crisis, which President Reif discussed, and the climate crisis and its relationship to the people who contribute the least but are exposed the most. And the question of environmental justice, environmental equity being part of a theory of the case of how we need to build back a more just and equitable economy, how we need to build for the future, how we need to tackle those four crises in their interrelated way. And he made a bunch of promises starting this summer about what he was going to try to do, and I'm going to go through some of those, and they echo and parallel some of the things that the chair said. I want to though underscore that what I started saying earlier: promises matter. The transition right now, which is up and running and has been running since before the election, is building on the strategies of that the vice president laid out, particularly in the speech he gave, detailed speech he gave this summer, that suggested that what we needed in order to restore the economy was $2 trillion of investment in transforming our energy economy. And I'm going to come back to that in a little bit when I talk about where we are in the Congress. What were his pledges? Consistent with, again, what the chair said, he pledged a net zero US economy by mid-century, by 2050. He thus aligned his administration with the EU, with the UK, China. President Xi announced at the UN General Assembly in his video speech that China would get to net zero or 100% clean economy by 2060. Of course, Todd's going to tell you how we got to drag them a little bit closer to that 2050 target. But again, the world is moving to this net zero by 2050 goal. Why? When Todd and I were working for Obama, we were trying to get 80% reductions by 2050. A couple of important things happened. First, the what we're experiencing in the natural world is at the high end of what the models were predicting in terms of damage. The IPCC 1.5 report, which I won't get into detail about, but demonstrated the delta between the harm to the natural world, the further degradation of planetary boundaries between a world in which global average temperatures were raised by 1.5 degrees C versus 2 degrees C, which was the Paris Agreement was under 2 degrees C or as close to 1.5 as possible. But that report had a profound impact on people's thinking and put people on track to say, what is it going to take to move the global economy to a world that's net zero, again, by mid-century. And that report also noted that that would require the transformation of the global economy at the size and scale never seen before in human history. So the people who are watching this Zoom, who are participating in this effort, are in a heroic effort for that over the next 30 years requires that level of transformation. What was Biden's strategy as he laid it out? Well, first it was to decarbonize the power sector while you're simultaneously trying to electrify everything so that it can be powered by clean power. How do you do that? And in that case, I think the Biden-Harris plan, again, it parallels the House Select Committee's ideas, but it's a shift of thinking of where we were, say, a decade ago. It really calls for these major investments sustained by the federal government, but deployed by the private sector and state and local government. It includes standards for accelerating the transition, and with a major focus on equity, taking care of the communities that have been left out and left behind, have borne the brunt of being sited next to the most polluting industrial sites and polluting power plants. $2 trillion, as I mentioned, 40% of that investment going to distressed communities. It was a major shift of strategy from Waxman-Markey, which Chair Castor mentioned, which really was a complicated economy-wide carbon pricing scheme to try to essentially price carbon and move the economy on a path towards greater acceleration of innovation. And I think the reason why the shift of strategy happened was, with respect to the political system, the price on carbon that people were talking about, it could decarbonize the power sector, but could not begin at the pricing levels that people were describing, get at these harder to decarbonize sectors like transportation, industrial pollution, and other high carbon intense solutions. So I think this shift towards investment and standards with a keen eye on equity happened. What does that mean, and can the president execute that? Well, first he needs a comprehensive strategy. I think that the lesson from Obama, particularly in the second term, was you need a comprehensive all-of-government strategy to make all the pieces working together. That's quite complicated and is a major governing challenge. It was what the president asked me to do when I came back to the White House. And I take the compliment from John, but it was really the president's vision to put this all together across various instruments that the federal government has to move things forward. Obviously, the question of control of the United States Senate is still undecided. There are two special elections, or not special elections, but runoff elections in Georgia that will describe the control of the Senate. It's a major difference between whether Democrats control the Senate and whether they don't, whether Chuck Schumer is the majority leader in the Senate or Mitch McConnell, whether they have full cooperation and can take that investment agenda that the vice president put forward and really enact it into law, or they'll have to settle for some sectors where I think they can get Republican cooperation, but really use executive authority and executive strategy more fully to get the kinds of goals that Biden and Harris have put forward. Let me just mention a few things and then turn it over to Todd to talk about the international scene. In the power sector, I think that there is the ability to extend the clean power tax credits. There's considerable Republican support for that. It will be combined with renewed standards under the Clean Air Act that is under the auspices of the Environmental Protection Agency. Obama tried to move forward the power sector through the Clean Power Plan. They may take a slightly more conservative approach given the conservative majority on the Supreme Court, but there's no question, I think, that they'll require improved standards, which means pushing more coal out of the system and eventually pushing natural gas that is not being utilized with carbon capture and sequestration to a more marginal role in the power sector. There's a lot of potential, I think, right off the bat to make progress there. For example, there are 5 gigawatts of offshore wind that have been sitting on the desk of the Secretary of Interior that are financed, that could move forward. There's competition between the Northeast governors to see that resource utilized. That could go up to as much as 30 gigawatts by 2030. That just needs to be permitted. So the fact that they have a team that cares about moving forward with renewables means those permits can happen, those projects can get underway, those jobs can be created, the ports, the construction can get going. In transportation, I think the administration is likely perhaps to avoid congressional action in this regard. They have both the capacity to set efficiency and tailpipe emission standards, again, under the Clean Air Act. I think they can embrace what California did in moving towards a system of more efficient system for cars and light duty trucks by 2025 and get the auto manufacturers well on their way to moving forward with full electrification of new car sales by 2030 with a goal of perhaps having all new car sales be electric by 2035. Same kind of basic structure and model works for heavy duty trucks on perhaps a slower pacing. I think in part of a green infrastructure bill that the chair spoke about, there will be, I think, bipartisan support for some elements of that, including transit, electric buses, et cetera. The administration has considerable authority to improve efficiency, both for appliances in the industrial sector and in the building sector. And they can do that through the Department of Energy, has been shown through past administrations, Democrat and Republican, until we got to President Trump, with respect to particularly the built sector and the building sector. The United States government is the largest owner and occupier of buildings in the country as a single entity. It's the largest user of energy, if you think about that, as globally as any entity. Professor Deutsch used to run a lot of this at the Department of Defense, but the Defense Department itself is a massive user of energy and has a lot of bases and structures under its control. They can move those to clean sources of clean energy. They can use the procurement authorities that they have to procure cleaner products, including things that go into that clean infrastructure. They'll tackle other pollutants, particularly methane. That's where the major release of methane comes from oil and gas production and transportation. get back to what President Obama was trying to do in terms of regulate and reduce both the flaring and the release of methane in that production. They can tackle the super polluting F-gas chemicals, which you're probably working at MIT, consistent with the provision that Todd worked on to get agreement under the Kigali protocol to the Kigali amendment to the Montreal Protocol to phase down and ultimately phase out these dangerous chemicals. The chair mentioned R&D. I think the president has a lot of both ability and power to get those accounts plussed up. He's called for a tripling of R&D, particularly in innovation in the hard to decarbonize sectors like steel and glass, but also in terms of hydrogen storage, other things. A big commitment on land use and conservation with a pledge to protect 30% of US lands and public waters by 2030, consistent with the global pledge to do that, to invest in carbon smart agriculture. I think one of the things you're going to see even more than we saw in the Obama administration is the White House working with the private sector to not only enhance the pledges that companies across various industrial sectors are making, not just tech or even retail, but even the hard to decarbonize sectors are making Paris consistent pledges. They're making net zero pledges by 2050. I think you'll see the White House try to both accelerate that trend, harvest those pledges, but create mechanisms of accountability so that we can see whether this is just PR or whether people are actually on track to meet those pledges, to understand carbon risk, to make that a priority, and of course, to build and to invest in resilience as we weather these terrible extreme weather events, the fires in the West, the effect of the storms in the Gulf and on the East Coast. We'll also need a climate-centered foreign policy, but I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Todd to describe what that looks like. Thank you.